It may be the third Sunday in Lent, but this is the fourth Sunday in the series of sermons that I have been preaching. Another series on our spiritual ancestors, if you will. And this one focused upon the people that sometimes get ignored in modern and postmodern pulpits because some of the things that they had to say were pretty harsh. So 3 weeks ago, we talked about the great prophet Elijah, one of the most honored in the history of Israel, who challenged the prophets of Baal up on Mount Carmel to a showdown. And there, because he had the courage to take on the powers that be of his time, Ahab and Jezebel, for once and for all, he proved to those who had been led to the side of the road toward lesser gods, that the God who had walked with them from beginning, from their Abraham and Sarah's days, and those who would follow, the one who was with them in Egypt's bondage, the one who had been with them all along, that God was the God who was still the one who was faithful to them, even when they had been less than faithful to God. Then we came to who came after Elijah? Pardon? Amos, my favorite. Probably young. Amos was a sheep herder from Tekoa. He would come and go, and he may not have been credentialed. He may not have been, of the educated of the day, but he saw what almost anyone who was looking and had perceptions could see, and that is a society based on incredible inequity could not stand. That God was going to judge Israel, and they were going to be found wanting. Probably the words were some of the earliest written down of the prophets after the Assyrians had in fact come and captured Israel. And they remembered, no doubt, the words of Amos, the hard words that they didn't want to hear but were true in his time. Last week, surely you can't forget last week. Hosea. I like Hosea because he's different. Kind of a loving prophet. We don't think of prophets as being loving. We kind of think of them as harsh. But God showed through Hosea's love for Gomer, according to the story as it was being told, that God would be faithful to Israel always, no matter what their failings, just as God is faithful to us day after day. Even as Hosea experienced infidelity time and again in his marriage, and the love of his life going off and selling herself as a slave into prostitution, he still went out because he saw how consistently faithful God had been. He went out and he took the shekels and the barley and the wine and he bought his loved one back. How much love? What kind of God is that passionate? Today, we come to the aristocratic prophet, Isaiah. Isaiah was an aristocrat in his time. He had access to the court. He advised at least 4 kings. And he was along, generally speaking, during the time of Amos and Hosea. He had a vision, and I've touched on this vision before because it's a powerful vision. And when we talk about worship, sometimes we need to be reminded of his experience in the temple. It was a discovery. It was a revelation about several things. And while he may have had great wisdom, and he may have advised many, many kings, there's always room for new discovery. As the story would be told, Uzziah was one of the more effective kings of Israel after Solomon. There weren't many. He had the capacity to govern and with some order. He had cut some alliances that the people depended upon. that did not necessarily hold true when they mattered. But generally speaking, he was a king to be honored. However, as the story is told, there was an occasion when he was waiting for a priest to come and light the incense to make the sacrifice, and he became impatient. And so, in a moment of haste, Uzziah did it himself. Now, let me say this one thing. You see, my theology is such where I wouldn't have any problem with that, right? If any of you wanted to be called to be church and people wanted to call you, that's okay with me, all right? Because you have gifts for ministry, even if you don't know what your gifts are, just as I have gifts. It's just true that I did take time to do some studying, and the seminary made its best effort with what they had. But I believe that all of us and each of us have been called to ministry. But in Uzziah's day, not so much. When he usurped the place of the priest by doing what the priest was supposed to do, all right, when that happened, there was judgment. The priest had a certain role. The kings had a certain role. And you just didn't cross those lines. And so what we read is before he left the temple, white splotches began to show up. And Uzziah, of course, died a horrendous death with leprosy. Isaiah watched that, was no doubt moved by that. And so when he had this vision, he already was set up to receive this understanding of God that perhaps he had missed in the past. And one of the things that Isaiah had seen, had come to realize, was that God was not exactly like the people saw God to be. The people in Isaiah's day had come to treat God as, well, God's on our side. Had come to see God as an everyday, normal, to be treated a little holy, but, we can trust God to be with us kind of thing. There was a familiarity that went on, and the sense of mystery had been lost by the people. How do I know there's a God? People ask. Well, I have a series of experiences, and then I begin defining God out of those experiences. But when Isaiah saw God high and lifted up, when Isaiah had this vision of who God was, it began to shift in him that people had missed the point of the relationship with the holy. Not only is God holy, but God is vast. And Isaiah began to capture that in this vision. That God is one who can be looked at through the most powerful telescope made by human beings, and the vastness of the heavens and the stars, some of which probably aren't even there now. And one could take a look at the vastness and see this incredible hand of God in creation. One can look through a microscope at this microcosm of creation and see all that there is through the microscope. And there is a mystery of God who is in the world not seen and the world beyond us. And this is who God is. That God is a complex mystery, not to be controlled, not to be presumed upon, but this is a God not to be trifled with. I grew up in a system with music, and even though I cringed at the theology, I still sing out of those Stamps Baxter shape note books. But implicit in some of that is the kind of Jesus is my buddy theology. God is immanent, high and lifted up. Transcendent, high and lifted up, but God is immanent. God is so personal that God is still concerned with the vulnerable widow and the orphan. This is who God is. And Isaiah began seeing all of this while he felt that the people had missed that point. He also began seeing that there was a sin in that for his own experience from which he needed to repent. The people seemed to have missed the point. And sometimes we too miss the point. Because once we begin defining God and we begin putting God into a box because we know truth, then almost certainly we have lost our way. I find fascinating the atheist writers of our day. I find them fascinating. I find their arguments fascinating, some compelling. Here's my problem. I want to say to them, if I ever had a conversation, I'm sorry, but I walked away from fundamentalism of my childhood. And I certainly don't want to take up with fundamentalists on the other side who absolutely know everything, but in turn have no sense of mystery. There is a mystery about who the one behind all things is that draws me onward, seeking truth, longing for vision, moments of just brief glances of knowing and light. God is complex and will not be owned and defined by any of us, but is to be experienced at times of joy, at times in pain, but one who's always faithful. When Isaiah saw what God wanted, this God who was transcendent and immanent, this God who was in all things and beyond all things, and realized the presumptuousness that people held in that relationship with God, someone in this vision needed to go and share the vision with others, to tell them that they couldn't presume that God was in a box and just on their side. That this God was capable of using folk like the Egyptians and the Assyrians and people throughout the known world of the time as instruments because God was far greater than what they knew. Then the word came to Isaiah, who will go? Who will share this word? Who will dare say to the people, you may have missed your way. You may have lost your vision. You may be presuming on the holy. Who will go? And in the vision, Isaiah so moved, so moved, so caught up by the presence of the holy. He says, and I can only imagine him stuttering. Send me. Because that's the best that I probably could have done in the midst of that revelatory moment. Send me with fear and trembling. I have been in ordination services. I had too many interns and they wore me out, especially in Dallas. And when Chris was moderator of the association for 3 years, she had to go to those ordination services and be on committee on ministry, and said that her great thrill was to proclaim in the name of the North Texas Association, the South Central Conference of United Church of Christ, I pronounce you ordained. There's a kind of a power in that blessing. I get that. But in the midst of the joy, I always wanted to whisper in the ear of the one being ordained, be careful. The potholes that you sometimes see as the honorary people in your parish, that's not the real danger. The real danger is when we begin presuming that we know God and have the truth. when we're just a small piece of the work of God, always and forever going on in the world. Isaiah got the mystery. He got it. He was overwhelmed by it. Didn't necessarily even need to see what happened to Uzziah to get it. Didn't even need to see a strange creature wearing a thong. That's why I love this church so. Don't you love this church? I can say that because Linda's such a person of grace, and I appreciate that. So, this was a God who could be counted on, but must always be honored. May this prophetic word settle in on us as we arise every day, not fearful, not afraid, not shame-bound, but anticipating, because we don't know it all, anticipating that God may show us something today that will astound us. Isaiah, our spiritual forebear, the aristocratic prophet, who still was able to learn from the Almighty God. May we be like Isaiah until the day we draw our final breath.